And Heidegger writes there, quote, Dasein is time, time is temporal. Dasein is not time, but temporality. The fundamental assertion that time is temporal is therefore the most authentic determination. And it is not a tautology because the being of temporality signifies non-identical actuality. Insofar as time is in each case mine, there are many times. Time itself is meaningless. Time is temporal. End quote. So, from Heidegger's point of view here, at least in this 1924 lecture, the notion of time itself would be meaningless precisely insofar as it would be tantamount to no one's time. And confronted with the difficulty of articulating the distinction between temporality as we experience it and time in general, the temptation to which Heidegger himself seems to have succumbed while elaborating the project of fundamental ontology, however audaciously he may have struggled with it before and after, is simply to deny the ontological autonomy of time itself and to reduce it to our temporality. To see how this may have come about, let us quickly recapitulate Heidegger's account of Dasein's threefold ecstasis in being and time. First, as ahead of itself, Dasein is becoming its own most possibility. Existentiality is grounded in futurity. Dasein is always already coming toward itself. Secondly, but in becoming that possibility, or going forward, Dasein is a returning to and a reappropriation of what it already was, its facticity. By going out towards its own most possibility in resolute anticipatoriness, Dasein returns to its always already having been, thereby authentically taking over its intrinsic finitude. And lastly, by becoming what it already is, Dasein gains access to entities in the Augenblick. This is Heidegger's own expression, the Augenblick, the moment of authentic presencing or making present. Now, and as we know, Heidegger distinguishes the temporality of existence, what he calls the Zeitlichkeit des Dasein, from the temporality of being, Temporalität des Sein. And the project of being in time famously falters precisely at the point where it becomes necessary to explain the precise character of their connection. This was reserved for the projected but never written third division. Nevertheless, Heidegger provides a glimpse of how he envisaged the nature of this connection in his 1927 lecture course, Basic Problems of Phenomenology. There, Heidegger maintains that Dasein as finite transcendence is not beyond, but rather a stepping beyond. And in Heidegger's own words again, quote, transcendere means to step over. The transcendence, the transcendent, is that which oversteps as such, and not that towards which I step over. Dasein itself oversteps in its being, and thus is exactly not immanent. So Dasein's temporal ecstasis is a transcending, a stepping beyond. But every such removal or displacement possesses a determinate orientation, a whither, as that towards which Dasein steps over. And that towards which Dasein steps over, we can tentatively assume would be being, which Heidegger also calls the transcendence pure and simple. Though, as we shall see, it is precisely this distinction which becomes problematic. The temporality of being is the ecstatic correlate implied by Dasein's ecstatic transcendence. That's the expression Heidegger uses in Basic Problems of Phenomenology. And Heidegger is careful to distinguish this relation between ecstasis and ecstema, which he takes to be constitutive of ontological transcendence, from what he takes to be the merely ontic reciprocity between noesis and noema, as correlated through the transcendence of intentionality. Intentional transcendence, whose trajectory goes from immanent consciousness to transcendent object, is, according to Heidegger, merely a derivative mode of this more originary temporal transcendence. The extematic horizontal whither is precisely not an objective correlate for Dasein's transcendence because it cannot be described as something which is. Yet Heidegger also insists that ecstasis does not thereby become a transport towards nothing. And quote, this is Heidegger again from Basic Problems. Rather, as removal to, and thus because of the ecstatic nature of each of them, the three ecstasies each have a horizon which is prescribed by the mode of the removal, the carrying away, and which belongs to the ecstasis itself. Each ecstasis as removal to has at the same time within itself and belonging to it a pre-delineation of the formal structure of the where-to of the removal. End quote. So, the extematic horizon for temporal ecstasis is not to be understood as a circular visual limit, but as that with which transcendence encompasses and delimits the bounds of its own stepping beyond. And consequently, the ontological horizon cannot be located in subjectivity, or in time, or in space. It is not. It is nothing which is. Moreover, if, as Heidegger clearly seems to suggest, the ontological horizon belongs to the ecstasis as a stepping beyond, then this surely implies that it has been somehow generated or produced in and through ecstatic transcendence. And indeed, the whole thrust of Heidegger's project in Being and Time seems to be devoted to showing how the structure of transcendence, bringing together the unity of the temporal ecstasis in what he calls the extematic unity of their horizons, reveals a productivity specific to ecstatic temporality and from which being in the world results. To interpret this ontological productivity as something which is simply beyond or independent of Dasein's stepping beyond would be to turn the temporality of being into a transcendental objective correlate for Dasein's ecstatic transcendence, and thus to hypostasize the temporality proper to being as something which is transcendental, over and above Dasein's movement of transcendence. But this would be to compromise the latter's specifically ontological, which is to say unobjectifiable, character. However, this refusal to reify the distinction between ecstasis and ecstema confronts Heidegger with a dilemma. How to conceive of the difference between ecstasis and ecstema without objectifying the latter, but without collapsing it into the former. To hypostasize the ecstematic correlate proper to the temporal understanding of being in general would be to compromise their rigorously ontological status. But to characterize them as entirely constituted through ecstasis would be to effectively subordinate Sein to Dasein. So fundamental ontology claimed to have outstripped metaphysical subjectivism, but now finds itself confronted by the choice between objective or subjective idealism. The structure of temporal transcendence seems to harbour some sort of intrinsic originary differentiation between a subjective and an objective pole, yet this differentiation proves inordinately difficult to configure on the basis of Heidegger's own phenomenological premises, without relapsing into the very distinctions between transcendence and the transcendent, or noesis and noema, which Heidegger claimed to have overcome. And no doubt this difficulty had something to do with Heidegger's abandonment of the project of fundamental ontology. But why does the latter seem to unravel precisely at that point where the existential analytic, outlining Dasein's ecstatic structure of transcendence, was to be surpassed towards an account of the temporality proper to being in general? Well, Heidegger's retrieval of the ontological problematic was to be effected via critical radicalization of transcendental philosophy. The fundamental question is not just of being, but of our access to being. How do we originally access the being of phenomena? Dasein is in the world, but also not just something in the world. And herein lies the rub. Where Kantian transcendentalism cultivated suspicion of unmediated access to phenomena, transcendental phenomenology countered with the revelation that the mediation is immediate, unmediated. That which is accessed is mediated, but the access as such is not, whether it be intentionality or finite transcendence.